My name is Gautam. I'm 22 years old, and I am the author of Remain Free. Remain Free is my memoir about my relationship with Troy Davis, who was a death row inmate who was controversially executed in 2011, despite a lot of evidence of his innocence. And the book talks about a lot of the behind-the-scenes issues on the case that were not really publicly reported in the media, as well as my own kind of personal growth and coming of age while being close friends with someone on death row. I came up with the idea to write this book about 6 months after Troy was executed, and the real issue for me was that the media had already moved on to the next story, and a lot of people knew the name Troy Davis, but they used his name and as part of the I Am Troy Davis campaign movement without really knowing who he was. And so I decided to write this book to really illustrate a lot of the things about the case that people didn't know or that weren't reported in the media, and to let people know who Troy Davis the human was, and not just Troy Davis, this kind of caricature that the movement made. And so really I wrote this book so people would know the truth of what happened and wouldn't forget who he was. I think the people who will relate the most to this book are millennials and younger people whose faith in the institutions we've been told are important, like the justice system, or politicians in politics, even our schools, has been shaken. I think the kind of combination of modern cynicism but also youthful optimism in the book really speaks to them, as well as the whole idea and transformation of my own personal beliefs in the story. I think is something that many younger people can relate to. I think what really makes this book special is that it's been built on hundreds of recorded conversations, in-person visits, and letters with Troy. So the bulk of this book is just Troy directly speaking to the reader from behind bars. And Troy wasn't allowed to talk to media, so you really won't get that anywhere else. In this book, though, you really get to hear Troy's voice shine through all that. You get to hear his own thoughts about what life was like behind death row, his own thoughts about the justice system, his own hopes and dreams and aspirations, and his own kind of unending optimism about what happened. And I think just the base story in general about a teenager from the suburbs who grew up in an upper middle class neighborhood, somehow befriending a death row inmate who grew up in Savannah in the 1980s when drugs were hitting the city. I think that's a pretty unique story, and I think that people can really learn a lot from it, just like I learned a lot from it as it was going on. The first time I met Troy, I was a little apprehensive because I was on death row and I was only 15 years old, but what really struck me about Troy the first time I met him was just how warm he was. He had these really bright eyes and this infectious laugh. He was always smiling and laughing and joking around. You know, if you were talking to him, you wouldn't really realize this is someone who had been in prison for half of his life, ever since he was younger than I am now. He was just this very caring and kind individual, and you could get that sense just within seconds of meeting him. And it really put me at ease because I was nervous just from being on death row. And talking to someone who I could tell immediately was interested in who I was and what type of person I was, and who seemed to already, just off the bat, care about me, it caught me by surprise, but it really explained a lot about what type of person Troy was. So as I talk about in the book, in the beginning, I myself was a supporter of the death penalty. And so I think a lot of death penalty advocates would relate to where I stood at the beginning, because the reasons I supported and the fact that it's supported would probably be similar to their own reasons for supporting it. But my own transformation from being a death penalty advocate to someone who wants to abolish the death penalty was the result of meeting Troy and learning more about his case and learning more about the death penalty in general. And I think that people who support the death penalty would really gain from that perspective, because they can see someone who believes the same thing as them eventually come over to the other side. I think it'll be a very eye-opening experience and offer them a new perspective on something they already have an opinion on. By the time Troy was executed, we considered each other family. It was a really hard moment when I received a letter from him the day after he was executed. It was like receiving a letter from a relative who had just died. He used to call me his adopted nephew, and I would call him uncle, because that's how we viewed each other. His execution to me was no different than how many people would feel if their own family member had been killed. And the worst part about it was that it was all premeditated. You knew ahead of time when someone you really cared about was going to die, and that really affected me. And it affected him too. He wasn't afraid to die, but he was afraid of the effect it would have on people he cared about, including his sister and his blood relatives, but also including me and other people who really cared about him and supported him. So I walked into death row thinking it would be, just my own media perspective of it was that there'd be these hardened criminals, really beefy, angry people who were dangerous and who you had to be scared of and had to be very, very cautious around. And what struck me the most the first time I visited death row when I was 15, and I sort of go in a little bit more in detail in this in the book, but I was struck by just how human they seemed. There were people there visiting their family members. There was a father hugging his son, and the son had a shirt that on its back said, "Free my dad." There was a mother and a child visiting a relative in prison. There were girlfriends and wives who were visiting. There were children. Some of the death row inmates' parents visited them too. And what struck me was that when I was there, I didn't feel like I was in danger. I felt that these were families that had been shattered by what had happened. And that's what I never really considered. I always saw these people as mugshots in a newspaper. 9 o'clock news, you see this person accused of murdering someone, but you don't really see the family behind them, or you don't really see that person's own childhood and what kind of terrible conditions they grew up in. And you don't really see that despite what they may have done, in the end, they still are human. And that's what really struck me about death row, was that despite all the brutality that goes on behind bars, and despite the terrible conditions that people on both ends, both the victims and the perpetrators of the crime, had to go through, then in the end, they're still people too. So as I write about in the book, one of the big transformations was kind of this. I believed in the death penalty when I was 15, and I had this very machine-like view of the justice system, that when someone's arrested, there are these two kind of streams. One stream is the innocent, and one stream is the guilty. And the justice system its job was just to sort them out. And like a machine, it would just efficiently and accurately select, all right, this person's innocent, let them go. This person's guilty, give them a punishment appropriate of their crime. And this is what we were taught in school, that we had the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, that we had a justice system that was the envy of the world. And by the end of the book, and right now, I learned that really isn't the case, that it's a very flawed system made of very flawed people, and it has its own biases, racial biases, biases against people who aren't as wealthy, biases just based on where you're located when a crime is committed. And it's not this unerring, impartial machine, but rather it's a flawed system made up by flawed people. And we shouldn't just take for granted that it's always going to be right or that it's always going to be fair. And my own views on the death penalty, of course, changed from being a supporter to being an opponent. Even my own religious views kind of changed, because one of the biggest ongoing conversations Troy and I had was about religion. His faith was what kept him going through 2 decades of being on death row. And I never really had a kind of similar spiritual crisis or situation. And so my own views on religion and faith, and just like the power of faith, really changed throughout that time as well. What I hope Mark MacPhail's family would get from this book, if they were to read it, would be that in the end we were all on the same side. It was never the Davis family versus the MacPhail family. It was never us versus them, because we truly believe Troy was innocent. And if you believe Troy was innocent, that means that Mark MacPhail's real killer is still out there. And the first step to finding his real killer is to acknowledge that the person we have now isn't the right person. And they suffered a terrible loss, and we should never forget that. And sometimes people could forget that just in the whole circus that kind of surrounded the Troy Davis movement. But in the end, we were all on the same side. because wanting justice for Troy Davis means inherently wanting justice for Mark McPhail. And I'd hope that they'd see that we weren't disrespecting their family member and we weren't marginalizing their own loss, but that we were also, in a way, trying to find Mark McPhail's true killer. So I think when you're at the Supreme Court level, or when you're kind of ensconced within the legal system, you can sort of forget the kind of on-the-ground effect that your decisions have. And I think this really would give them a human touch, or a human perspective on what their decisions result in. I think that laws without morals are useless. And we shouldn't forget that in the end, that laws serve to promote a certain type of society, and that we need to ask ourselves the tough questions, not just is this following a law or is this not, but is this law just? And I think from a legal perspective, what I want people to take away from it, including legal scholars, is just that Troy Davis's execution didn't have to happen. And even a federal judge admitted that his case showed at least a minimal level of doubt. And if there's any doubt in a death penalty case, there should be no execution, because you can't undo an execution. And unfortunately, in Troy's case, it was a binary sort of decision. You have to, once he was convicted, it was guilty until proven innocent. And he had to prove himself at this very high level of evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he was innocent, which is very difficult once you're already behind bars. And instead, there should have been a third option, where not just prove yourself innocent or get executed, but just show at least some level of doubt, some way any reasonable person could say, like, yeah, maybe he's not the one. And that should be enough to at least commute a sentence to life in prison instead of execution. So when Troy was executed, the last thing he said minutes before he was executed, and I read these words in the book, were that he wanted people to continue to fight this fight. And what he meant by that is he wanted people to go out there and free the other Troy Davises of the world, because he knew his wasn't an isolated case, but that he just represented many others. And he said that he was not afraid to die. He was just afraid of more injustice in a broken system. And I think the Innocence Project best embodies Troy's own vision and wish for the future. The Innocence Project works to free wrongfully convicted people, and they also work on the policies and procedures that lead to innocent people being convicted in the first place. And so it was a really easy decision to donate all the money to the Innocence Project, because they embody what Troy wants our society to be like, a place where people aren't wrongfully convicted and where we're aware of our own limitations in the justice system and can work to prevent them from happening in the first place.